And if you follow 10th Amendment Center and our work, you might be aware that on Friday, after 8 long years of hard work and many tries, and we can call them failures, but I think a lot of times the failures are just a learning phase and a step forward as long as you keep pushing. Well, the state of Missouri finally passed the Second Amendment Preservation Act, and it is now going to the governor. So on this episode, and that's a huge deal. They're not alone in this. There are some other efforts that have gone forward as well. But now what we're seeing is that this 10th Amendment strategy to support and protect the Second Amendment, recognizing that going to the federal government to limit the power of the federal government is a totally failed strategy, is starting to gain some steam. So on this episode, I want to go through some of the history of that strategy, where it came from, some of the names behind it, because I think understanding that history, where things started, where things have gone since then, can inform us on building and improving and implementing our strategy to defend the Second Amendment and liberty in the years to come. You're going to hear about some big names like Judge Andrew Napolitano and even Ron Paul, through an old school 1970s staffer who was involved in this effort. And then you'll be surprised to know that a Green Party candidate actually was one of the leading people in developing the strategy and pushing it forward. And there's a bunch of other unsung heroes of liberty that I want to talk about as well. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage has everything you need to follow this program, all the archives. On individual episodes like this one, I will include links to reference and read and learn more on your own time. We also have all the different platforms we're on. We're on a bunch of video platforms. We're also audio-only podcast edition, like on Apple Podcasts and Podbean and Spotify and everywhere. You can find all those and even our membership program, where you can put your financial faith behind our work, and absolutely nothing, and I mean it, nothing helps us reach and teach more people every single day than the financial support of our members. Our membership program starts out as little as $2 a month, so we try to make it really affordable. All that and more over at the show homepage, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, all spelled out. And while we allow people a few more moments, especially on the mainstream platforms, to get notifications, to join us on this live stream, I want to say a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat. There's Blue North, good to see you. Patricia, Tim Martin in Arizona, Dixie Strong, Haji 54, Clay Kent, Tyler B, Liberty Revolutionary. My scroll is not working. Greg in Texas, MRGF, Kenneth in Arkansas, Adrian, Murray, Ray, and everyone else. I appreciate you spending some time with me today. I apologize for anyone that I'm missing, but I want to get right to this. Let's start out, first of all, with John Hancock. This was on the last day of the Massachusetts Ratification Convention in 1788. For those of you who follow my work, you know, or you follow the history here, you know that Massachusetts was kind of a tipping point. They were counting votes in January of 1788, and here we are, Sons of Liberty. The place where they were debating the Constitution was ready to reject it. Had Massachusetts rejected it, maybe the tables have turned a little bit in modern times, because Massachusetts is no cradle of liberty anymore. Well, none of the states really are. But Massachusetts, had they rejected it, it was very unlikely that New York and probably Virginia would have said no as well. So when people like John Hancock and Samuel Adams got on board with ratification with a promise from Federalists like Theophilus Parsons to put together the 10th Amendment, we know that John Hancock was actually, in his own writing, was drafting proposed amendments to the Constitution as far back as just weeks after the Philadelphia Convention ended in 1787. So when Massachusetts made the deal to say, we're going to ratify as long as we can recommend these amendments, the first of which is something that really was a precursor to the 10th Amendment. Then John Hancock and Samuel Adams got on board, and that's when the vote passed. But here's how Hancock put it in that final day speech in support of ratification. He said it like this. Oh, I should pull this up on the screen. The powers reserved by the people render them secure. Yeah, there's going to be problems. We might, government is government. We all recognize that government will always grow in power. But as long as people recognize that they have powers that have been reserved to them, they didn't give away everything. And even the stuff that they've delegated away, which is different than giveaway, they can take back. I think that's a separate discussion. But Hancock was pointing out, like, look at all the power that's been held back to the people of several states. If you use it, you will stay secure and free from the potential tyranny of a consolidated, centralized government. Now, as far as using these powers reserved to the people to protect the Second Amendment, I've done a lot of work on this, and I don't want to go into really any detail as to how that plays out. I will just reference this previous episode I did last November on the 11th of 2020. Second Amendment preservation, foundation to nullify federal gun control. This is a state-level piece of legislation, which actually can be used on a local level to deal with the feds as well. It can be modified a little bit as long as it's an ordinance. But it sets the foundation to reject, resist, and ultimately nullify federal gun control in practice, even if the feds never repeal or strike down any of it. So I encourage you to check out that episode to get a kind of a detailed of how the strategy plays out. But where does this come from? Where did this idea come from? I mean, in some ways, I've often pointed out, like, we've really put this out there here at TAC, but we were not the first. We were basically carrying an idea that had been built and worked on for a long time, even before the 10th Amendment Center ever started back in 2006. Mind you, that's a reminder, we are having our 15th year anniversary at the end of June, so I just want to say thank you to everyone. I'm not going to do a lot of celebration because we got a lot of work to do, but I just want to point that out and let you know how much I appreciate you being here with me and all the people who have supported us, whether financially or just sharing stuff and sending people to our website to learn more and take action. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Anyways, so if we want to really understand where things come from, we really got to start with this guy. I know those of you who listen to the show, you probably know the name by now. You should. This is an unsung hero of liberty that a lot of people don't know outside of hardcore activists. Gary Marbett, who was a 2010 candidate for the Green Party to run for Montana State Senate. He was also an independent candidate for Montana House back in 2012. But this is not your normal gun rights activist. This is a Montana gun rights activist who lives in an eco-friendly home. He's a really great, nice human being. Not to say that other people aren't, but this is not your normal gun rights activist. But he is one of the most tenacious, dedicated ones in history. And I think it's surprising to think about someone who would be a candidate for the Green Party is the one who really created, and maybe he would tell me differently that he got the idea from someone else. I don't know, but I'm crediting Gary Marbett for drafting the legislation, drafting some of the original strategy, and then learning and building from it and expanding upon it, giving us something to work with that we could build and expand on, that we can pass off to someone else, that they were able to build and expand on in Missouri and elsewhere. But Gary's really the intellectual start. And he has been running an organization called the Montana Shooting Sports Association back in the mid-1980s. I think he had some issues with the NRA not doing a really good job there or something, and he decided to start his own organization. And they have passed over the years more than about 3 dozen, maybe it's more, 3 or 4 dozen pro-gun bills in Montana. And if you go through this list of stuff at mtssa.org, you start to see glimmers in the 90s of efforts to use the 10th Amendment, that is the powers reserved to the people of the states, to protect them from federal overreach. The first one that I really noticed as being one that's notable here was a non-binding resolution in 1997. And here he lists it as their response to overzealous federal officers. If you think about the context of this, in 1995, we know that they passed the unconstitutional Brady Act. And the Brady Act specifically tried to commandeer state and local law enforcement to enforce federal gun control. And then we had the lawsuit from Sheriff Jay Prince and Sheriff Richard Mack, which went to the Supreme Court and reaffirmed the long-standing anti-commandeering doctrine, which comes from James Madison in Federalist 46 and has been reaffirmed by the Supreme Court, basically a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. So this is the context of the timing is a big deal here in the mid to late 90s. And here's how they put it at MTSSA. mtssa.org. Many people are concerned about the actions of overzealous federal officers. MSSA believes the county sheriff should be able to protect us from federal police who exceed their authority. 1997, they're taking this position. This resolution passed in 97. It asks all now mind you, this is non-binding, and it's just non-binding resolutions are very powerful strategic tools when used as non-binding resolutions. Unfortunately, I just have to make a side note today. Most of what you may hear about is creating a so-called Second Amendment sanctuary in a local community. There's hundreds of them around the country. I have found almost none of them that are actually sanctuaries. They're almost all non-binding resolutions making a declaration of a particular position, which in and of itself is a great starting point. In fact, John Dickinson, the penman of the Revolution in 1767, in response to the hated Townshend Acts, was calling upon all the colonies to support New York in response to the New York Restraining Act, which was part of those. And he said, small things grow great by concord. Concordia res parve crescunt. It's actually in raised text somehow on our membership cards, because we know that each small step can lead to another small step to advance liberty. Jefferson, some years later, told us that the ground of liberty is to be gained by inches. So Dickinson thought in the years leading up to the Revolution that non-binding resolutions, a statement of principles, could be a powerful starting point to call people to a particular principle, a particular issue, rally people, and then you build upon it. And that's what we see starting out in the late 90s in Montana, thanks to Gary Marbett and the Montana Shooting Sports Association. They authored this resolution that asked all federal officers to notify the county sheriff prior to any arrest, search, or seizure in the sheriff's county. It requires the Montana Department of Justice to maintain a log of federal operations in Montana and note which ones happened with advance notice to the sheriff. And he's actually still pointing out that they're going to work on, if they need to, they're going to work on passing a sheriff's first law. So this has been in the books. They've been cooking this for a couple of decades now. And C, requires, so there's some requirement in this resolution as well, requires the Montana Secretary of State to send copies of this resolution to a long list of federal agencies. And then they also passed a law in Montana to help, and I haven't really read through this, but they list it as helping exempt Montana from federal gun-free school zones. And it says, thanks to MSA, state law is now in place that exempts anyone in Montana who is protected by Montana's constitutional right to keep and bear arms from this federal law. I don't know how that one plays out in practice, but you recognize this type of strategy. Like, look, this isn't about getting a new politician in Washington, D.C. to overturn something. This isn't about lobbying or protesting in Washington, D.C. This isn't about going to a federal court in the hopes that the federal court will side with the founders and the Constitution over the federal government, which rarely happens. This is literally strategies, however effective or not they were. These are the first attempts of using this type of strategy. The powers reserved to the people render them secure, as John Hancock told us, in Montana, to protect them from the federal government without relying on the federal government. So that's Montana. Then we have this guy, former state representative. I think he's still in some part of office in Montana, former state representative Roger Koopman in Montana. Here's a little history about him. Koopman was a graduate of the University of Idaho and worked for U.S. Representative Steve Sims in Idaho, and then for Representative Ron Paul as Ron Paul's press secretary and communications director. I believe, and I haven't been able to verify this, that Koopman was the press secretary for Ron Paul back in his first time in office back in the 1970s. So this is kind of some old school libertarian Ron Paul movement stuff here. Koopman served 2 terms in the Montana State Legislature, winning District 70 House seat in 2004 and re-election in 2006. Well, what happened in 2004? In December of 2004, October of 2004, so even before that point, if you're familiar with the Gonzalez versus Raich case, which is the cannabis case that came before the Supreme Court, which is just garbage, that is often, to me, seen as kind of a starting point for this type of efforts. But really before that, Montana, Gary Marbett, Montana Shooting Sports Association, he probably worked with other people. Maybe Gary wrote it himself. I know he does a lot of this himself. He is an expert. He's written a book that sold thousands of copies on gun laws in Montana. We have a lot to learn from him. But they drafted this piece of legislation before October 7th, 2004. And Koopman introduced it and filed it. It actually, well, let's read a little bit of the text from the bill. Here, The 10th Amendment to the United States Constitution guarantees to the states and their people all powers not granted to the federal government elsewhere in the Constitution, and reserves to the states and people of Montana certain powers as they were understood at the time Montana was admitted to statehood in 1889. The guarantee of those powers is a matter of contract between the state and people of Montana and the United States as of the time that the compact with the United States was agreed upon and adopted by Montana and the United States in 1889. This is a pro-gun bill in Montana. The first section is the 10th Amendment. The powers reserved to the people render them secure. If you want to protect the Second Amendment, you have to use the 10th. Because if you're not, you're missing a huge part of the problem. That is, the federal government cannot be counted upon to limit its own power. That means you cannot count on Congress to restrict Congress. You cannot count on the courts to restrict Congress. You cannot count on any of them to restrict the executive branch, because the federal government is the source of our problems. And in fact, much of the garbage on the state and local level is funded by the federal government as well. It's implemented through federal-state joint task forces, which I've covered in depth elsewhere. But if we're striking the root, we have to recognize, as the founders did, that centralization of power is the great problem, and the way we solve them is in our states and communities. So that's a section. The first section in this Montana pro-gun bill in 2004, which was for the 2005 legislative session, says the 10th Amendment. And then some of you will be familiar with this type of legislation, which we don't see as much anymore. And here, a personal firearm, a firearm accessory, or ammunition that is manufactured commercially or privately in Montana and remains within the borders of Montana is not subject to federal law or federal regulation, including registration, under the authority of Congress to regulate interstate commerce. It is declared by the legislature of Montana that those items have not traveled in interstate commerce. If you build something in your state, you own it in your state, you sell it in your state, this is not interstate commerce, this is intrastate commerce. And we know, going all the way back to the Wickard versus Filburn case and a few others, and the Gonzalez versus Raich case in 2005, the federal government takes the position that anything and everything is somehow interstate commerce. Clarence Thomas, who I don't always agree with, actually had a good point in that cannabis case in 2005. He said, basically, and I'm paraphrasing and probably butchering it, but the short version is, if the federal government can regulate 6 plants grown in someone's backyard for home consumption that never crosses state boundaries as interstate commerce, its commerce powers are limitless. And this came up before, and I think this was in the lead up to that case as well, because it was first filed in 2002 by Angel Raich. Anyway, so they're saying this is not interstate commerce. It is declared they have not traveled in interstate commerce. This section applies to a firearm accessory, or ammunition that is manufactured in Montana from basic materials and that can be manufactured without the inclusion of any significant parts imported from another state. Generic and insignificant parts, accessories that are imported into Montana from another state that are subject to federal regulation as being in interstate commerce do not subject a firearm to federal regulation under interstate commerce because they are attached to or used in conjunction with a firearm in Montana. So they're basically saying, look, the commerce power is out of control. Here in Montana, we're going to try to do something about this. In 2004, before any of us even knew any of this was really happening. Maybe there's someone out there, an outlier. I didn't know. I was probably still mostly commie at that point. Not mostly, but I still had some remnants of that. I founded the TAC not for a couple more years in 2006, so I wasn't talking about 10th Amendment stuff. I wasn't learning about it. This is really, really historic stuff. It actually passed the House by a vote of 73 to 24. It died in the Senate Judiciary Committee. So they have an every other year session in Montana. So they tried again in 2007. It passed one chamber, I believe, and died. And then it finally got passed and signed into law by Democratic Governor Brian Schweikert, I believe. So drafted by a guy who's now a Green Party member, signed into law by a Democrat, a 10th Amendment bill to protect, a 10th Amendment law to protect the Second Amendment in Montana. Now, as soon as it was signed into law, the ATF was not happy. And here I have downloaded, just for posterity's sake, a 2009 letter from the ATF, an open letter to all Montana federal firearms licensees. The idea of an FFL shouldn't exist. The ATF shouldn't exist. It should be a private business selling stuff, not throwing people in cages for owning firearms. Anyway, so they sent this letter in July of 2009. Shortly after it was signed, it was going to go into effect on October of 2009, and it says specifically, just a short piece here. However, because the act conflicts with federal firearms laws and regulations, federal law supersedes the act. It's as if the ATF is judge, jury, and executioner all in one. They're telling you, we don't care what you've passed in your state. It is already determined by us here that our enforcement action, our regulations, our laws that we enforce, well, they're supreme because we said so. And of course, they're twisting and they're taking advantage of government-run education, which has taught us that as soon as a federal act is passed, it's immediately supreme until a federal court tells us it's not, instead of the idea that it's only supreme if it's in pursuance of the Constitution. That's another episode, but they said federal law supersedes the act, and all provisions of the Gun Control Act and the National Firearms Act and corresponding regulations continue to apply. The ATF is always going to do that. They're always going to take that position. But this is important to know. The ATF was pissed, and they continue to be. Here in the Wall Street Journal, they did some coverage on this, and they point out, you can see a picture of Gary there as well. This started to get some attention after a number of other states started passing these. They're called Firearms Freedom Acts, using 10th Amendment and opposing a Commerce Clause approach. We don't really see much of it anymore, and I'm going to get into why in a moment. But for years, Mr. Marbett, they write in Wall Street Journal, that a wide range of federal laws, not just gun regulations, should be invalid because they were based on an erroneous interpretation of Congress's constitutional power to regulate interstate commerce. Mr. Marbett, they write, isn't basing his pro-gun effort on the Second Amendment. Mind you, Gary ran for state senate as a Green Party. This is not where you would hear this normally, this 10th Amendment approach, but this is maybe why I love Montana. But he isn't basing his pro-gun effort on the Second Amendment, the one that talks about a right to bear arms, but on the 10th, which discusses the limits of federal power. And this is a quote from Gary. This is really about states' rights and federal power rather than gun control. There is an emerging awareness by the people of America that the federal government has gone too far, and it's dependent on a really weird interpretation. So that's Gary right there. Then from there, Gary we started pushing out some information on this. 2008, 2009, we really started tracking this type of effort more in 2009 and early 2010. So Gary was kind enough to invite me to speak on a panel that the Montana Shooting Sports Association was hosting at the 25th Annual Gun Rights Policy Conference, which was held, of all places, in San Francisco. So it was just a short trip for me. I met my old great friend Anthony Gregory up there for the first time. We had an awesome time, and I gave a 9-minute speech. You can see here if you're looking at it. I've got the video embedded. I will link to this so you can check it out as well. I will link to it in the show notes, but there's Gary hovering over me because I was getting close to that 9 minutes, and he swears, I think to this day, that I went over my time, but the video says otherwise. So I gave this speech basically pointing out for the first time for 10th Amendment Center, which I founded back in 2006, our nullification strategy to the gun rights community. That is, connecting it to the cannabis approach. And I think that's what they were really doing with this commerce approach in Montana back in 2005. I've never actually asked, was that the same mentality? But I think the recognition was that if you're just doing something in your own state, well, screw the feds. I think you should have that mentality all the time. So I pointed out in that speech that even though there was this Gonzalez versus Raich case in 2005, which held that even though someone grew 6 plants in their backyard in California, the federal government said, well, we can still have prohibition. That's still interstate commerce. And I pointed out, like, look, at the time that that case came down, there were 10 states with medical laws on the books. And you would think the federal government says, well, that's unconstitutional. We've gone to court. The federal courts say that's too bad. The feds are still supreme. You would think they've all been repealed. And I pointed out, I'm pretty sure in that speech that instead of repealing them, you saw 4 more. So there were 14 at the time that I gave that speech that were still having the backbone to say, even though the federal government is telling us we can't do this, we're going to do it anyway. And that's the message that we started pushing around that time, a little earlier as well, at 10th Amendment Center to the gun rights community. And thanks to Gary for inviting me up to that event. Now, hear from Gary himself. This was just in April in support of a bill that they got passed, House Bill 258, which is a line in the sand against future federal gun control. He talks a little bit about this history. He says, in about 2011, I was in New York City. So that was 2010, late 2010, that Gary invited me up on that do that speech. He had been doing this work for a few years, and then he was in New York City to appear live on the Glenn Beck Show. I was actually invited for that event as well. I couldn't go. I believe I recommended Kevin Gutzman, and he was on that show and did a great job. But he was invited to appear on the Glenn Beck Show to discuss the Montana Firearms Freedom Act. While waiting to warm up, I met Judge Andrew Napolitano and engaged him in conversation, especially about politics in Montana. I told him about the Sheriff's First Bill, this idea not just taking a resolution that they passed in 1997, but they actually crafted a piece of legislation for Montana that we've seen introduced a few times in a number of other states that he actually was talking about this year, maybe a good follow-up if law enforcement continues to enforce things that they shouldn't be doing. This bill that would make it a state crime for a federal officer to arrest, search, or seize in Montana without the advance written permission of the elected county sheriff. I mean, great in theory, great in principle, but Napolitano said to Gary, you don't have to go that far. You only need to not help the feds enforce their gun laws. Without local help, the feds simply don't have the manpower to enforce their gun laws. And Napolitano wasn't talking about this publicly at that time, but he was saying this to Gary Marbett in 2011. We know he made the same statements. We've linked to it many times in articles on our website. He started talking about this on Fox Business and elsewhere, that if a state simply bans enforcement of a federal gun control, it would make those federal acts, in Napolitano's words, nearly impossible to enforce. This is a powerful step forward. Gary says that suggestion made a lot of sense to me, so I came back to Montana and wrote that into a bill which was introduced for MSSA in 2013. I've told the whole story of that history from 2013 going forward in a previous episode just a month or so ago, Fortitude and Perseverance, a lesson on liberty in Montana. I encourage you to check it out, how they took this anti-commandeering approach of not using resources to help the feds over years, 2013, 2015, 2017, 2019, and 2021. And it really takes going back to the well and hammering over and over and over. And that brings me to this guy, Ron Calzone in Missouri, who I think is also an absolute treasure, a hero for liberty. He's kind of elusive. You can never really get a good picture of him. But there he is with a hand on a stack of, I think, 1,100 witness forms where his organization, Missouri First, a long time ago, started using this approach, getting people to sign on and print out. They would sign on his website, and they still do to this day, these witness forms in support of a piece of legislation. He prints them out and gives them, drives to the Capitol in Jefferson City and gives them to the committee members to show that there's a huge number of people who are supporting a piece of legislation here in support of the Missouri Second Amendment Preservation Act. I actually met Ron in 2011. Before that, probably 2009, 2010, he is also one of these guys that is using the 10th Amendment. A lot of people might think of him as a Second Amendment activist because he's the lead activist in support of the Missouri Second Amendment Preservation Act for 8 years now. But he has also used the same strategy against the Real ID Act, against Obamacare, and a number of other things. It's just that this is the one that has really caught on. So I met him in 2010, 2011, over email and then in person at an event that we hosted in Kansas City called Nullify Now, where Tom Woods and a bunch of other people were speaking in support of this type of a strategy. And then we first released our own model legislation, Second Amendment Preservation Act, in the fall of 2012, started emailing it out to all the state legislators that we could get contact information for around the country. We published this page. It's an old archive page from archive.org for the grassroots and encourage them to send the legislation. Our legislation, when I look back on it, actually kind of sucks, but some people took it and improved it. So Calzone in late 2012 and early 2013 started working with this guy, Dave Rowland, another unsung hero of liberty from the Freedom Center of Missouri. Dave has worked on the Missouri Second Amendment Preservation Act for many years to create something that's actually effective, that can get passed, and they finally did. So that in 2013, we know House Bill 436 from Representative Doug Funderburk, and the Firebrand Senate Bill 235, former state senator Brian Nieves, was introduced. It actually passed on the first try in Missouri. It passed both houses. and it got to the governor. And here you can see from MissouriFirst.org on July 9th, 2013. Ironically, Governor Nixon chose July 5th to veto the Missouri Second Amendment Preservation Act. So what a day to actually veto a bill to protect the right to keep and bear arms, which is such a huge part of the run-up to the revolution, the separation from England. Ron makes some good points in this blog post about it. But that went to a veto override session, and it failed by one vote. I think Senator Ron something or other, some Republican, wasn't on board with protecting. But this was a time where we basically started doing a strategy shift. So I covered this strategy shift in, first I want to mention Kansas. Also in 2013, the Second Amendment Preservation Act, with a lot of great work from friends of the TAC and others. Rob Wood is a guy who often watches the show. I don't know if you'll see him out in the live chat today, but Rob was very instrumental in pushing the grassroots to get this piece of legislation passed. The Second Amendment Preservation Act, signed by Sam Brownback, was signed, what year? This is, I think, in May of 2013 as well. And it actually is kind of a quasi-combination of this Commerce Clause approach and the anti-commandeering approach. So the first part was this Firearms Freedom Act, similar to what was passed in Montana in 2009. So that's the main part. But that's the part that most people focused on. There's this other part that I covered in this report that I have up on the screen that is just awesome, and with some work could really have an impact in favor of your right to keep and bear arms. It set the foundation in law to ban state and local law enforcement from enforcing all federal gun control on the books, past, present, and future. But as I pointed out in that article, and what we did through a lot of email campaigns, we even drafted local model legislation for Kansas specifically in 2013 and 2014, that in order to really move forward on this, you have to ban enforcement of federal gun control. You can't just say that federal laws don't apply here, because everyone's going to still try to enforce it when you violate it. If you just say it, it doesn't change things. So adding the mechanism to actually tell them you're not allowed to do this anymore is an important step. So we really urged people to do that. And I pointed out in the first report on this, the state isn't going to magically stop enforcing federal law. This is back in 2013. Unless you get active and take steps to enforce the unenforceable section of the Kansas Second Amendment Protection Act, nothing will change. Nothing. Guaranteed. And I warned about that in 2013. So over the years, a guy named Shane Cox, hero of liberty as well, another unsung hero of liberty, started under the Firearms Freedom Act, the Commerce Clause part of it, started manufacturing parts. He started manufacturing, I think, and selling suppressors. He was advertising it publicly. He made it very clear he was doing this under the Kansas Second Amendment Second Amendment Protection Act. I get these confused. There's the Firearms Freedom Act, Second Amendment Protection Act in Kansas, then the Second Amendment Preservation Act that we have, and then in Missouri and elsewhere. A guy named Jeremy Kettler bought it. I'm sure he was selling this to a bunch of people. I'm not sure how many sales he was doing, but they both got busted by the ATF with help of state and local law enforcement. Local law enforcement helped them bust it. So you didn't ban the enforcement mechanism, and then these two get busted. They may have been busted anyways, but it would be far more difficult for the feds to pull it out without logistical help. So here, Judge Martin, this was actually sent to us by a member, Glenn Perdue, who has been supportive of us for a long, long time. Thank you, Glenn. This is back in 2017 that Judge Martin sentenced Kettler to 1-year probation with a $100 payment required to the Federal Crime Victims Fund. Pretty, like, just a slap on the wrist, really. Back in the 90s when this was happening for the weed people were going to prison for years on this type of approach. So years later, it's not as bad, but it's still terrible to get this happen. He sentenced Cox to 2 years probation for the 8 counts he was found guilty of, and this requires 8 times $100 payment that must be paid to the Crime Victims Fund for a total of $800. And this is really the important piece here. This is what Shane Cox told ABC News. Quote, "Someone had to take one for the team. I was doing it out in the open. It wasn't a secret thing. Sooner or later, people have to start exercising their rights without first waiting for permission. Now, unfortunately, when you only have one dude doing it, it becomes very easy to target that one guy and shut it down. And then, unfortunately, a lot of people in the gun rights community have looked at this and said, see, look what happened. One case, one attempt, and now we're not going to even try on this anymore. And we get a lot of gun rights organizations, a lot of liberty organizations saying, see, this is like this lose your Second Amendment rights act, not the Second Amendment Protection Act. But they're failing to understand that government will never stop enforcing stuff until they find a situation where it becomes politically disadvantageous to try to do so. So courage from this guy, Cox. Somebody had to take one for the team. I was doing it out in the open. It wasn't a secretive thing. We need millions of people like him going forward. Here, NBC News actually started to recognize in 2014 that there were actually two strategies developing. They say the two types of bills are the primary vehicles for the nullification movement. This is actually a pretty fair piece that they did back then. The first type holds that federal laws do not apply to firearms manufactured and sold within a given state. These bills cite the Constitution's Interstate Commerce Clause to argue that the federal government has no power to regulate trade within states. It's correct, but then how do you stop them from doing it? That's really the key. And then the other approach, they say, says gun regulation falls outside the scope of the federal government's power, making it state territory. Such bills, often titled the Second Amendment Preservation Act, usually say state officials cannot enforce federal gun laws or limit their ability to do so. Some bills seek to punish any state employees or elected officials who help the feds. And then they quote Mike Meharry, communications director here at TAC for a long, long time, our lead blogger and writer and I think he does so much. But here's what Mike says at NBC. It's basically saying, federal government, if you want to enforce federal firearms laws in the state of Arizona, that was a good example, you're welcome to it, but we won't give you any assistance. So in other words, no state police help with ATF raids, no local law enforcement enforcing a federal gun law, none of that, said Mike Meharry, a spokesman for the 10th Amendment Center, a for-profit nullification group based in California. I love that they add for-profit. We are proudly capitalist pigs here. For free market, for-profit. We are not an IRS, whatever these, 501c3 or 527. We don't want to partner with the organization that we don't believe should exist in order to get some kind of bonus from them. And then they're going to try to restrict what we can do and say. No way. Not a chance. Anyways, side note. So really, what we're talking about here is a shift in strategy. So there was originally this Firearms Freedom Act, this Commerce Clause approach, and then the anti-commandeering approach. And after that first round in Missouri and what we saw play out in Kansas doing the quasi approach, plus things that we learned from Texas and Montana, in Texas specifically, Greg Abbott, when he was the AG, and I covered this in a previous episode, Greg Abbott actually kind of tightened up the language, talking about this approach, saying, like, look, we're not going to enforce anything that isn't on the laws in the books of our state. It is reestablishing that the state is the primary decision maker on these types of things, that the feds really don't have any authority. The feds, if they want to partner with the feds, they can only do it to enforce state laws, not the other way around. And then the strategy becomes very clear going forward if you get one of these passed. That is, every time you repeal a state gun control measure, you get a 1-2 punch. You get rid of the state gun control, which is a win. But then at the same time, if the similar law or the same laws on the books in the feds, then the state and local police can no longer enforce that either. So this is a really powerful first step forward that really, I think, came from Greg Abbott, or he expanded on this, the legalese, at least at the time. So it's unfortunate that the bills that he's supporting today aren't nearly as good as when he was AG, but now he's governor. It's a different story. Anyways, I covered this whole strategy, this anti-commandeering approach, many, many times. But here's an episode, James Madison, How to Defeat Federal Programs Without Relying on the Feds to Limit Their Own Power. I will link to that in the show notes. We're getting close to the end here. And I'm glad that Mike actually mentioned Arizona, because this is another state that we've been working on this anti-commandeering foundation to set a nullification of federal gun control for many, many years. We had a lot of opposition from the NRA and from the establishment right, but we finally got one passed this year, House Bill 2111, was signed into law in April, and the new law bans the state and all political subdivisions of the state from using any personnel or financial resources to enforce, administer, or cooperate with any act, law, treaty, order, rule, or regulation of the United States government that is inconsistent with any law of the state of Arizona regarding the regulation of firearms. It passed 17-13 in the House, 17-13 in the Senate, 31-29 in the House. It will go into effect 90 days after the legislature is done. Sometime this summer, that one goes into effect, and we will put out a report on that when that one goes into effect. This is a very powerful first step, and there's no exceptions. As long as people want to keep working on advancing the right to keep and bear arms, they don't have to think about the feds. They literally just focus closer to home and work to repeal laws on the books in Arizona. And that creates an automatic ban on enforcement of any similar or any redundant law in Washington, D.C. And then, as I mentioned right at the outset, just last week, Friday, after 8 years of trying, I think the bill was introduced and pushed forward 8 consecutive years. Unfortunately, during the Trump years, we heard from Republicans, oh, we don't need this. There's no point of this. So it was much more difficult when Trump was in office to actually get this piece of legislation moving forward. The absurd part is that Trump, for 3 straight years, enforced a record amount of federal gun control and bragged about it. He was horrible on the right to keep and bear arms. He was horrible on the Second Amendment. Of course, we have the bump stock ban as well. But anyways, in the culmination of 8 years of work, Mike Meharry writes, today, and this was last week Friday, the Missouri House gave final approval to a bill that would end state and local enforcement of a wide range of federal gun control measures, past, present, and future. Enactment into law would represent a major step toward ending federal acts that infringe on the right to keep and bear arms within the state. And I just want to sum this up. Really, we're talking about, and we've got a few other pieces of legislation, like I mentioned, in Montana. There's also a second step that's happening in Idaho that we've covered. But we're talking about a line in the sand against new federal gun control measures there. So you're thinking about names like Gary Marbett, Green Party candidate in 2020, the Montana Shooting Sports Association, the 10th Amendment Center, Judge Andrew Napolitano, Ron Calzone, Missouri First, Greg Abbott, of all people, Dave Rowland from the Freedom Center of Missouri. These are all the people who have been so instrumental that we've learned from and built upon. An old Ron Paul staffer. This is where it comes from. And remember, we're really just getting things started. And to sum it up, I want to go back to this quote from Samuel Adams that I point out so often lately. And this is how he put it. Instead of sitting down satisfied with the efforts we have already made, which is the wish of our enemies, the necessity of the times more than ever calls for our utmost circumspection, deliberation, fortitude, and perseverance. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope you learned something from this history. I hope we can find the places where we've had pitfalls and learn from that and not repeat them. I hope that it inspires you to take action, to recognize that we're really just still getting things started. We've got so much more work to do to protect the Second Amendment and basically the entire Constitution and our liberty from the centralized monster state, which is the largest government in the history of the world, in Washington, D.C. I really appreciate you being here. Of course, if you enjoyed this episode, you enjoyed our work, please smash the like button, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or elsewhere. Comments in the archive, sharing links, subscribing, all that stuff helps us spread the word because it triggers the algorithm, tells the platform to show the program to more people. And of course, as I mentioned before, you can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month. That's 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I will check the chat a little bit later today, see if there's any comments that give me insight or ideas or questions that I can answer or ideas for future episodes. You can also email me at team@10thamendmentcenter.com. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you had a great weekend. I look forward to seeing you next time here on the Path to Liberty.